Good afternoon. Could we start? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Those who were there this morning and those who are joining us this afternoon. So, welcome to this Parliamentary Network, Women Free from Violence, and our annual thematic conference, which is focusing on mobilizing political forces to prevent combating violence against women. The previous sessions addressed two different topics in two different sessions, one on supporting and implementation of the Istanbul Convention, and just before lunch, another one on political action to counter attacks against Istanbul Convention. And the panelists in these two first sessions included our very important external partner representatives, namely from European Union, from United Nations, and also the chair of the Gender Equality Committee, which is, of course, the intergovernmental part of our work on gender equality, as well as the chair of the CREVIO, which is one of the monitoring legs of our Council of Europe Istanbul Convention. And this last session of this conference that we are now starting will be focusing on cooperation between political and civil society to prevent combating violence against women. And just like our previous partners that I mentioned before, and of course our member states and our national parliaments and our parliamentarians, civil society is really a vital partner in our common goal to achieve zero tolerance of violence against women and also to end violence against women. As in most of our member states, the overwhelming majority of our services for victims of domestic violence and also victims of sexual violence are run by non-governmental or civil society organizations. The civil society, therefore, has a long-standing tradition of providing shelter, legal advice, medical and psychological counseling, and also running hotlines and other very important services. However, in many of such services, funding is not secured, and they operate in a sometimes very focused small geographic space. So in most countries, the overall number of available services does not eventually match their needs. So often there is a gap, much more is, especially now with the COVID times, there are much more needs than actually there are possibility to support these victims. It's not and it's because it's often a voluntary service and there is not compulsory funding for them. It's maybe for this reason, and certainly for this reason, that the Istanbul Convention recognizes the work of the civil society and seeks to ensure greater political and also financial support for their work. It includes specific provisions that oblige parties to encourage and support their work by tapping into their expertise, involving them as partners in multi-agency cooperation, and supporting, of course, them in their awareness-raising efforts. And this can help, together with the other partners we have, to achieve results. So importantly, the civil society also play a role in the monitoring of the implementation of the Convention. Many of the civil society organizations, they send what we call shadow reports to those who are carrying out monitoring of the implementation of the Convention, and this is something that is very, very important in formulating the final report on this monitoring exercise. And of course, lastly, as we heard this morning already, civil society plays a very important role in raising awareness, and then, of course, as a second step in changing the mindsets. And this is something that, especially in today's environment, I consider myself as a very, very important role for them. And as one of the previous speakers, namely the president of CREVIO, Mrs. Luarasi, underlined that it's often this type of mindsets that in the long run lead into violence against women. So I think this is indeed one of the most important aspects also that we have to concentrate on today. So without longer introduction, I give the floor to our first panelist. We actually have 4 panelists this afternoon. And the first one is Ambassador Andrej Slapinčar, who is the permanent representative of Slovenia to the Council of Europe. And also importantly, he is the incoming vice chair of the Committee of the Parties of the Istanbul Convention. So first of all, let me congratulate you, Ambassador, for your election as a Vice Chair to this Committee of the Parties. You will start your mandate in February 22, so very soon. And of course, the Committee of the Parties is a very important part of the Council of Europe's work in this area and to ensure the efficient implementation of the Istanbul Convention. Ambassador, could you please tell us what could be done to further promote cooperation between politicians and civil society to prevent violence against women? And what are the main recommendations of the Committee of Parties in this regard? The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon, and thank you for this invitation and the opportunity. The topic is very relevant and timely, and I followed with great interest already the morning part of today's meeting. I welcome the engagement of the Parliamentary Assembly and the close cooperation with the Committee of the Ministers' Deputies. I will try to present the answer to the two questions from, let's say, theoretical and practical perspectives, and from committees and national perspectives. Let me start with the national perspective. Slovenia signed the convention in 2011 and ratified it in February 2015. By adopting this important international document, Slovenia has joined the group of the most progressive countries in the field of human rights, protection of women, and combating discrimination. The beginnings of the work of NGOs in the field of violence against women in Slovenia as an important part of civil society goes back to 1989, when the first association was established to provide psychosocial assistance to women and children who were victims of violence, at the time when prevention of violence against women was not systematically regulated in my country. It was because of the work performed by the NGOs between the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s that society started detecting domestic violence. NGOs did not only strive for recognition of domestic violence, but also for more resolute response to it and punishing perpetrators of violence. Today, numerous NGOs are active in prevention of violence, each actively contributing in their particular field and with its way of work to preventing violence against women and domestic violence. The role is largely connected with awareness raising and provision of services. Secondly, you are probably aware that our 6 months presidency of the Council of the European Union is ending in a few days under the slogan, Together Resilient Europe. Why I'm mentioning it? Slovenia was together in trio with Germany and Portugal in the joint declaration by Trio on Gender Equality from July 2020. We called for inter alia high standards for preventing and combating all forms of violence against women and girls and protecting and empowering victims and survivors of gender-based violence everywhere in the European Union. And with this in mind, support also the EU's accession to the Istanbul Convention. And Slovenia focused on cyber violence as a form of violence against women and girls. That's why it is important to compare notes and synchronize between international organizations as much as possible. Now to the two questions, the theoretical and practical perspective. NGOs active in preventing and combating violence against women are key actors in the implementation of the Convention. That is why under the Convention, state parties have a legal obligation to recognize, encourage and support their work and to establish effective cooperation. NGOs are also major partners in monitoring the implementation of the Convention. The Grevio recognizes the important role the NGOs play in this field and made it clear that NGOs and other members of civil society are vital sources of information and that all information received from NGOs will be treated as confidential. NGOs are therefore strongly encouraged to give their input and share their concerns at any time, including what you have mentioned, Madam Moderator, for example, through the shadow reports. When starting its first evaluation of a particular country on the basis of its questionnaire, Grevio, whenever possible, invites NGOs working in that country to provide relevant information. Grevio also carries out visits to all countries party to the convention in order to make a more thorough assessment of the situation on the ground. During these visits, its delegations hold meetings with NGO representatives, and in addition, Grevio may consider using further means of evaluation, such as organizing hearings for NGOs. There are many recommendations by the committee how to reinforce the role of civil society in providing support services. And in many of these recommendations, committee recommends that appropriate human and financial resources for general and specialist support services for victims of violence be ensured, including through sustainable funding levels. For example, Committee of the Parties last week at its 11th meeting adopted recommendations for 3 state parties, Poland, San Marino, and my country. If you look at them, you will see the above-mentioned recommendations more in detail, and also the nuances in the progress by different countries, and of course, on the basis of this, also tailor-made recommendations. In Slovenia's case, the NGO participate in drafting the annual report. They were invited to submit their opinions and possible proposals for amendments and changes. The final report has been approved by the government and the parliament acquainted with it. In Slovenia's report, the committee welcomed the integral role of NGOs in preventing and combating violence against women, but at the same time, it recommended a number of measures. I will not go into detail. You can, of course, read them in the recommendation. But as a general policy, let me just mention that the government is considering that NGOs perform a very important, socially beneficial work and supports transfer of public functions and powers also to the NGO sector. The NGOs in Slovenia perform a number of tasks. They help victims and their children remove from the relationship with a violent partner. Their support includes counseling and assistance in reporting violent events to the police. In cases when the victim is completely economically dependent on the partner, such organizations also provide shelters where women with children can find shelter. These are women's shelters which are placed in concealed locations across the whole country, where victims can live free of charge for the maximum of 1 year. There, victims are also provided counseling, advocacy, and assistance in finding a job, and they are also accompanied in various institutions and procedures. The NGOs also provide assistance to perpetrators of violence by including them in behavior change programs, carry out various campaigns and projects, organize lectures, preventive workshops, and trainings. The ministry responsible for social affairs finances these activities to almost 2/3, and the municipalities finance the rest. To conclude, to stay in the 10 minutes allocated time, I would like to mention the following. While we had many reasons to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the convention, a lot remains to be done. Moreover, as we have heard this morning, there are many attempts to undermine the achievements. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic augmented the violence against women, especially the domestic one. Therefore, it is up to the governments not only to uphold their existing engagement and commitment to prevent it, but to reinforce it. This should include also the reinforcement of the role of civil society in providing support services for women victims of violence, and to ensure appropriate human and financial resources for general and specialist support services for victims of violence, including, probably the most important one, through sustainable funding levels for women's NGOs that provide such services, as it is also consistently recommended by the committee. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, dear participants, for paying attention, and thank you for congratulations on the elections, and I look forward to working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Slapnitsar, for your words. And of course, we are equally looking forward to working with you as you take your office in February. Thank you for having spelled out nicely what is the timeline of the preparation of the Grevio reports, and how you, also in the Committee of Parties, how the civil society actually does contribute a lot, and how their contribution is taken on board. And also thank you for giving the example of the Slovenian civil society work and how they are really contributing in a very, very tangible way to this common effort to combat violence against women. So I now turn to our second panelist, who is Ms. Marcella Pirone, who is the President of Women Against Violence Europe. And of course, we all know WAVE, and it's a very powerful network, active in all over Europe, and a very important partner for the Council of Europe. We have done quite a few events together, or awareness-raising events, and I think they have always been very impactful and useful. Ms. Pirone is, of course, she has a long and impressive experience as women's rights advocate, both as a lawyer and as an activist. Ms. Pirone, you have the floor.
Sorry, I had some technical things. Can you hear me and see me? Yes. Good. First of all, I wish to thank you very, very much for this invitation. And I have been listening since this morning, and I'm really very, very impressed by the, of course, very interesting inputs, but also by hearing from all experts who intervened how important it is for all of them and for all of us, civil society representatives, to really cooperate, to really be in a joint effort. I am here representing the WAVE network, which was established in '94 as an informal network and is a legal entity since 2014. And as a network, it is composed of more than 160 European women's NGOs of 46 European countries, all working in the field of combating violence against women and children. The WAVE network aims to promote and strengthen the human rights of women and children in general and to prevent violence against them. It aims also, as we heard today, a very important aspect, to establish gender equality, recognizing it as the root of all forms of violence against women, and I hear that we agree on that. WAVE is the only European network formed by women specialist services, focusing solely on the elimination of violence against women and children, and it adheres to the aims of all European institutions and United Nations, stressing the importance of working towards ending all forms of violence, in accordance with Vienna Declaration on Violence Against Women, Istanbul Convention, Beijing Platform, and all other related documents. And in particular for the EU countries, WAVE supports the ratification process of the Istanbul Convention and the EU accession to it. WAVE thinks that after this long-expected European Court of Justice decision, which was issued last October, it seems clear now that member states can reconsider strongly to conclude the process of accession to the Istanbul Convention, which would be a very important political and substantial act for all European countries, not only the EU, of course. WAVE expects, in this sense, strong engagement by all committed national political representatives in the EU organs, first of all the Council, but not only, and WAVE will ask its own members to strongly lobby for this in their own countries and as a whole network in the EU. We really think that this is, specifically in the moment, this particular political moment, as we have heard this morning, it would be a great sign for a united Europe against violence against women. In fact, the strength of our network is somehow this, we see it as this, to be able to be aware, updated, aware of political movements, aware of what our women, the women we help, are facing every day. We are engaged at national, regional, and international level, reciprocally trying to nourish and contaminate ourselves as members through a good central coordination, but also, and this is our main aim now after so many years, to bring in all public and private stakeholders this joint effort to tackle the male violence against women and girls. And in this sense, I could mention, as I was asked, in our long history of WWF, with some inspiring examples of good cooperation between politicians and civil society, some before Istanbul Convention was even issued. I'm thinking about Spain, when Spain reformed holistically the whole state system to fight violence against women and girls, being absolutely inspired and also actively cooperating with the women's movements and the women specialist services who were active since long. Austria was also a country which issued, again before Istanbul Convention, an intervention multi-agency system preceded by long, and this is very incredible if you think how now it's still a problem, long years of interdisciplinary training among all professionals, from the judges to the police, to all services, to the social, to the health. And this was, as said, a very good example, and I think an inspiring model for also what was then set as a multi-agency approach in the Istanbul Convention. I'm also thinking about the Nordic countries, our Nordic countries members, who could also always show us, I mean the other members of a bit more poor countries in this sense, they could show us the incredibly considerable funds invested in women's specialist service support services, in being really aware of this issue. And this is only examples, as I said, before Istanbul Convention, but of course, Istanbul Convention is a very particular moment because it has formalized that the issue, the problem, the pandemic, as was said rightly, of violence against women and girls is a relevant political issue for all. So all have to see that it's not only a marginal problem, but it is for all countries, all societies, all women, and there is to be considered what against this problem has been done by the NGOs, by the women NGOs, as we have heard repeatedly this morning and just now. Istanbul Convention will, for all these women activists and professionals of violence, an enormous recognition. And let us not forget that some of those contributed directly as Cavio members to the contents of the editing of the Istanbul Convention. This is a brilliant example of fruitful and competent cooperation between representatives of women's civil society and policymakers, politicians, in this case at European level. I will not repeat what has been said about the vital importance of women's NGOs and especially the women's specialist services being heard as experts for every political decision that must not remain only on paper, but must show its effectiveness and usefulness in concrete implementation. Women's frontline services, who in many countries have reached more than 30 years of experience, can say best how. In those countries where the Istanbul Convention is in force, I can bring us an interesting consequence that the interlocution with politics, with politicians, has finally found an official framework, a terrain from which no politician can escape. It's not anymore what we, civil society, or only women or only feminists say. It is an official framework. We all have to move inside it and with respecting it. This is in fact seen above all as a consequence and as a good result in the legislation of many countries who ratified the Istanbul Convention. We have better legislation. We have some new legislation in many countries, and some even some countries, I can talk about our members in Hungary, for example, managed to implement some Istanbul Convention principles at local and somehow also at national level in direct services, in direct actions, even if not having actually ratified the Istanbul Convention. So we see that there is an incredible force and power which the women specialist services and the activists have absolutely recognized and bring through and do in constant interaction and the search of a dialogue with the politicians. I will mention COVID as another good example, where several states, not all, unfortunately, not many, but some very considerable ones, have given specific recognition of the incommensurable values of the emergency and all-round work of women's specialist services by specific extra funds. We have heard funds is a crucial point, and funds are always insufficient. So this was quite an important result of this recognition. I want to conclude raising some critical issues to be looked at in the cooperation among civil society and policymakers and politicians in order to have maybe a common thoughts about this. Consultations. Why do I mention them as a critical issues? Consultations, of course, seem and are an incredible, important instrument to bring us together. On the other hand, we have, as WAVE, and I think we are not the only ones, we have to, at this stage, emphasize or bring to your attention how many consultations we are required to participate to, and with no extra recognition of funds, no extra recognition of energy, time, which has to be spent. But on top of that, which we are, unfortunately, I would say, used to do, but what is not so reassuring is that we are starting to have a bit of questions and doubts about the effect of these consultations. Why are we saying that? Because we see that there is a too big amount of consultations. There is no criteria in choosing who should participate. We see incredible amounts, mountains of documents, of declarations. Some are written 20 times by not the same person, but the same NGO, but you can recognize. So there is a misuse and abuse of this instrument, and we really feel that it's impossible for the institutions and for the ones who really want to hear from civil society to filter all this. There is always a very short time, and the consequence, the risk is that then the actual consultations is not possible anymore in this democratic tradition, transparent way, but becomes again an old-fashioned way of consultations, which was the personal consultations in terms of politician contacts and so on, which is not what, of course, is desired. So I think the instrument of consultation with things that it's important, but it has to be absolutely improved and looked up again, so that it's not a formal online, it's not only a formal online consultation, but it's a real participation. That's one issue. Another issue is that, and it comes also from observing these consultations, but generally speaking, observing what happens in our countries, on the territory, in the proper work, in the proper actions, we see this increase, this upcoming trend of gender neutrality. This is what is really worrying at the moment. If we talk about effectful policies and contacts between actors, civil society actors and policymakers, everyone, and I'm not talking about the experts sitting here today, but I'm talking outside in our societies, and I would say in all countries, by today, everyone uses words and speaks somehow like experts on violence against women, because everyone can copy and steal words, and also the so-said best practices or actions. The problem is that we have violence against women is now finally, and this is a good result, the awareness is high. It's finally an important issue for all. But the problem is that there are too many improvised new actors, policymakers, who are really not aware of what this really means, what this problem means. They are not taking attention and time to really go to the roots of the problem, to really go and look for the proper and the real experts. And so the danger is that we are seeing in many countries, and WAVE is observing it from its central view, but also in every single member countries, we are observing, and then we were told, for example, about this from the Nordic countries, from Sweden, Finland, which was also somehow noted in the Gravy reports, as we know. So we are talking about countries who have a great tradition in tackling violence against women, but that this gender neutrality means that the contents are somehow turned around, manipulated, and they are not really guaranteeing actions and responses which are in line with Istanbul Convention. So this is something we want to really raise in terms of a sort of invitation to the politicians and to all of us to be really dedicate more time in having an exchange about also what the language means, what we talk about when we talk about best practice. Why is this a good practice? Which context is it in? To really go in depth, to really take our time and our energy to reciprocally nourish our knowledge, our sincere and honest effort, so that it becomes a proper effort and a common effort, which we all wish. I have to close here because I'm talking too much, so I really want to be respecting the time. I really thank for this today's very good example of precious exchange, and I want to thank WAVE is always very grateful to the Council of Europe as a whole, and today specifically to its Parliamentary Assembly for the immense effort and engagement you have shown and always show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pirone, and I think your intervention was a perfect example of how much wealth of information we get through our interaction with the civil society. So thank you very much for your examples that you brought up. And also for, I think what was important, what you draw attention to the fact that actually Istanbul Convention and Kavio that you mentioned that was preparing the Istanbul Convention text was very much relying on promising examples and practices and information coming from the civil society at the time. And that maybe explains also why the convention is not only gold standard, but it's a very practical tool of actions that should be taken to combat violence against women. So I think that was an important point to draw attention to. And also I think indeed while we are very keen to consult civil society, I know exactly what you mean by referring to the inflation of information that maybe we get, and also the difficulty to draw the main important points from the information that should be then taken into account in our monitoring reports. So thank you very much for your intervention. Actually, the third panelist from Human Rights Watch, Hilary Marquardt, just sent a message before the event that she had to pull out, so we don't have the chance to listen to her today, but I hope soon, because Human Rights Watch is one of our very important partners as well in this area. So the next panelist is Ms. Reka Sefrani, who is the president of European Women's Lobby, and of course also who has a long experience in gender equality issues, and especially also at the national level. So we are very keen to hear from you. So my questions to you, Ms. Sefrani, would be, could you tell us about the work of the European Women's Lobby with parliamentarians and political actors in general? And then what would you consider as the most effective channels for this cooperation? Thank you very much, Ms. Sefrani. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Council of Europe to this very important event. And I'm honored to be asked and for your interest in our perspective on this issue. To introduce myself first, I am the president of EWL, the European Women's Lobby, which is the largest platform of women's organizations in Europe, with more than 2,000 members or member organizations in the EU. And also in candidate countries, we're present in the UK and in Iceland as well. Together, our aim is to build a feminist Europe. And actually, since the inception of EWL 30 years ago, fighting violence against women and girls has been one of our core priorities. EWL works on this issue, in particular through the Observatory on Violence Against Women and Girls. It gathers experts from among our member organizations all around Europe to do research, exchange information, and to realize joint campaigns. Together with our members throughout Europe, we lobby and work in close cooperation with politicians and decision makers to advance the fight against the violence against women. We had, for example, our members mobilized to reach out to their MPs when a report on gender-based violence was discussed in the EP last September. As another example, EWL supported the Turkish coordination of our organization when in March, the President of Turkey announced withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. We organized 2 events with EU institutions representatives and meetings with high-level representatives of the Commission in order to gather support against the withdrawal. EWL builds on the lobbying of the members at national and international level, especially during the 16 days of action, when online and offline actions are taken by all our members. We make sure to amplify our joint messages for a Europe free from violence against women. For example, our members also participated in 2 waves of campaigns to popularize to the public and to decision makers in different fields the Council of Europe's recommendation on the prevention and combating of sexism. The culture of sexism, we believe, is the basis on which the continuum of violence against women and girls exists. This year again, EWL itself has had campaigns and actions with decision makers on violence against women and girls. We have been calling on members of the European Parliament to support a pledge addressed to the President of the EC and Commissioners Dalli and Johansson, calling for a strong and broad law to combat violence against women and girls at EU level. And therefore on Friday, the 10th of December, on International Human Rights Day, I sent them a letter showing the support of these 72 MEPs that we mobilized. This action closes the 16 days of activism, and like every year, we aim to shine a light on one of the largest human rights violations that affects millions of women and girls in Europe. And we call on decision makers and all to react and end violence against women. We know the numbers and the proportions. I'd like to remind that 1 in 3 women in Europe are affected by physical and/or sexual violence, and 1 in 2 women in the EU have experienced sexual harassment since the age of 15. The violence against women and girls can even lead to death. In 2017, 854 women victims of homicide by a family member or intimate partner was recorded by Eurostat in 16 EU member states that provided the data. Unfortunately, IGA expects that it will take more than 3 generations to achieve gender equality in the EU in the future. And I'd also like to point out that the costs of gender-based violence have been estimated and only a fraction of that cost is now turned to specialized services which can mitigate the harms and prevent the repetition of violence against women. The impact of COVID has been devastating, especially for women and girls. EWL has been very active in finding out in its member states or members to what extent this was the case. And we also found that domestic violence spiked during the pandemic. All in all, we really welcome that the European Commission will release a long-awaited proposal to combat gender-based violence against women and girls. And together with the 72 MEPs, signatories for our pledge, we are calling for an ambitious text on all forms of violence. It must adopt an intersectional, gender-sensitive and holistic approach and aim at protecting all women and girls in Europe. We call for the directive to recognize violence against women and girls as a crime under the European treaties, thus providing the institutions a clear legal basis to tackle all forms of male violence. The directive must build on the standards of the Istanbul Convention and take a step further by concretely addressing sexual exploitation and tackling new forms of violence like online violence. In our view, prostitution and sexual exploitation is also inherently violent, and so should be dealt with under the Violence Against Women Directive. Women and girls have a right to safety and protection on and offline. As mentioned before, the implementation of the Istanbul Convention has brought great progress in the ratifying countries, as our special report on that also attests. We see that 96% of positive changes in policies have occurred, 83% of positive changes in protection, 70% in positive changes in prevention, and 61% positive changes in prosecutions have occurred in those countries which have ratified the Istanbul Convention. But there is still much to be done. All the EU member states should ratify the Istanbul Convention, including the EU. It is urgent that the EU ratifies it as soon as possible, and therefore we call upon the upcoming French presidency to take swift action after the European Court of Justice's decision for the EU to accede to the Convention at a qualified majority. I would like to finally point out the importance of a united front on violence against women and girls, and the greatest role of the politicians here at the EU, also at national level and international level alike. As co-leader of the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, we engage with governments from countries outside of the EU to advance the fight against women and girls, violence against women and girls as well. Because we believe we all need to mobilize together to put an end to this violation of human rights everywhere in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Safrani. Very interesting points that you brought up, and thank you also for your positive examples and figures of those countries that have ratified the Istanbul Convention and what are the measures that they have actually brought in these countries. And these are often the issues that we have also tried in the Assembly to focus on, to show that Istanbul Convention actually is not just a gold standard on paper, but actually it does bring very tangible results on the ground. Also, thank you for bringing up the sexism recommendation, because I think very quickly in the area of violence against women, we did realize that, there is this side of sexism also that is very much at the root of the violence against women, and it has to be addressed. So I think now it's also time to try to make sure that our recommendation, although a soft standard, not legally binding, is very well known and used by everybody who so wants to do. So I will now turn to our last panelist in this session, who is Ms. Veronica Vitton, who is a board member of the Women Against Violence Europe. And I would like to put a question to you to know especially what your cooperation with the parliamentarians and more generally with the politicians at the national level, and also what would be the main obstacles that you see in this regard and how to overcome them. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Ms. Vitton.
Thank you, dear madam. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation, first of all, and for very relevant discussions and very interesting issues which were raised during the whole day. My name is Veronica Vitton. I'm the WAVE member, so I'm presenting here WAVE board. But also I am the coordinator of the National Coalition Live Without Violence from Republic of Moldova. Is a national network which is specialized on preventing and combating gender-based violence, but also which is working on related issues such as poverty, such as women in risks, trafficking, prostitution, and so on. As you might know, the Istanbul Convention was ratified recently by the Republic of Moldova, and I would say this is a great achievement after a long period of stubbornness of our political parties to ratify, because it was signed in 2016 by the former president, and because of political views and political direction of the parties, so it was postponing all the times. But also we had the church pressure and church somehow lobby in front of our politicians to not ratify. Somehow it's not something new, I would say, for the region. So responding to your question about the good part of working with politicians, so I would like to emphasize and somehow to reinforce what just Marcella said about the role of women, women organizations and women activists and women network. Because because the result of ratification of the Istanbul Convention, it was also mainly due to the pushing the political parties, pushing the politicians, and having very, I would say, huge resistance toward the pressure of church. From a network, because it's clear and it's obvious you can do something important in the field of women rights alone. So if it's one organization, if it's one initiative group, so we will not resist, and they will not have that force and that arguments and the power to somehow to move the things ahead. This, I think, it's one thing which we should consider, because in the networks of the donors and the politicians, somehow they and this is a part of women movements. So usually, you invest in one organization, in one initiative group. Somehow it's not very common to invest in the network, at least I am talking about the region of Moldova, of Ukraine, and these countries in post-Soviet countries. It's somehow not used to invest in the capacity of women networks, organizations, women activists, women initiative groups, and so on, because it's good for politicians and for their allies and for their friends to keep women divided and to reinforce the competition between women organizations. So I think this can be put as a good result or a good example to have a very strong women network, which bring together the expertise from the ground, the grassroots expertise, but also who can be in the front line, and also to bring the supporters. And we have supporting mass media initiative groups, human rights defenders, activists, diaspora, also women from diaspora who are very active in the process of lobbying and advocating for ratification. Another things, it's I would say we have to pay attention to the process, not only to the result, because the result, it's good. We have convention ratified, and we prepared this process from the legal perspective, because in the coalition we have several types of organizations: service providers who are providing direct services at the grassroots level, but we have advocacy, very good in advocacy and legal expertise. And this multidisciplinary, I would say, in a women organization and women coalition, it's very relevant, because you don't have only theoretical approach, but you can bring practice, you can bring stories, you can bring what is happening at the grassroots combined with legal expertise. So these having these different types of organizations, different types of groups, representing different groups of women and extremely vulnerable as well, but also different other women. So this one is advantage, and it helped in the process of ratification. But also, I would say this result somehow is very fragile, because we see what is happening in Turkey, in Bulgaria, in Hungary. There is backlash, but also because we had a good chance, let's to say, but we explored it, having a ruling party who positioned themselves as pro-European party. And Istanbul Convention is pro-European standard, it's European standards, and the political party used these standards in pre-election process, in election process, and afterwards, because in Moldova we had a donor-driven agenda most of the time, and political parties try to fulfill the donors' requests as well. But at the same time, we are fully aware that this result is fragile, because if this political party in several years will lose the ground, for example, or will lose the majority, so we can be in the situation of Bulgaria or Turkey. That's why it's important to have in the front line, but also in the backyard, very strong women organizations who are very united and cooperate among themselves. Also, what I wanted to emphasize what just Marcella said about the consultation. And for me, consultation, or not for me, but let's say in Moldova, it's very often consultations are very formal and technical, and do not have this authentic involvement, authentic contribution of women organization. And I would say consultation have to involve women activists, women organizations, women groups in different stages at the designing of programs, of development of different policy public documents, in the designing programs by donors as well, because Moldova is the country where the majority of services, or let's say the majority of intervention areas, are covered by donors. So women organizations have to be consulted in all stages of working on gender-based violence, in designing programs, in the implementation, in the monitoring, in the evaluation, in the whole decision-making process, including the budgeting and financing the intervention areas. So another thing what was mentioned by the speakers before, this is linked somehow with the consultation of women organization. Yes, funds are insufficient, and we know this. For services, it's always, we don't have always sufficient funds, or let's say long-lasting or sustainability of funds. At the same time, we have funds for areas which are not priority for our women organization, and we always find in regarding the political parties and donors and other stakeholders, what the real priorities, the real needs of women are not included in the agenda of political parties, because as we said, and funds are insufficient for real priorities. Yes, they are insufficient because they are covering something which is not relevant for us in that moment, in a certain moment, for a certain group or a certain area. So I would say we somehow have to think how how to push ourselves in the political agenda in all consultations with different stakeholders at all stages of working on gender-based violence. And last but not least, I think that it's very important to link all women organizations from different regions and to share our expertise, to share similarities, and to share the challenges, because sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have all the responses in our women friends and the women colleagues from different countries in the region. So this I wanted to say and to emphasize during my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting and fruitful presentation. And I think, indeed, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is a wealth of information available. And I think you underline it very nicely also, how it's important to have the women and the organizations involved at all the different stages of action already when they are being conceptualized. It's important to hear them already then to make sure that actually resources are going to the areas that are the most relevant at that moment. So we have now concluded the round of the panelists. So what I would like to now invite is that the participants who are listening to us online, they can put questions to us, to the panelists, and we will, from here, Strasbourg, try to handle that in a very efficient way. So do we have any requests for the floor? We do not have yet, but maybe while we wait for participants to reflect, I'll follow the example of our General Rapporteur, Zita Gurmai, and put the question to the panelists to have your wish list, and namely, what would you expect on your wish list from the parliamentarians and politicians to make your work easier and also to together achieve better our common goal, namely combating violence against women? So what would be number one on your wish list, dear panelists? If I can call Ms. Pirone, if she's online, could I consult your wish list, please?
Yes, it's Christmas. We have a long wish list, of course. And difficult to choose the main two you asked, but I think that what we have been hearing today, I find really important and precious, because I hear that there is a common wish, and the common wish is the overall wish that we can assure all women and girls, at least in Europe, but I would say in the world, to live free of violence. But that's, I heard with a certain concern that it needs 3 generations to get to, according to AGE, to have equality. I don't want to hear how many generations it needs to have a life free of violence for women. So this is the overall wish I heard from everyone, and that's a very important frame and the important energy we can build on. My wish is now enough with words, because the words were necessary, as I said. The words were necessary to raise awareness. The words were necessary to name everything in a way that we can understand each other, that we can look at the issue with the same view. But now we need actions, and we need joint actions, and we can, as Veronica very clearly said, we have already done so much. There are so many actions. We only have to have the will, and this is the political will, and this is a very important wish to all policymakers, to the parliamentarians, we at all levels, international, regional, and national, that we really have to have a wish and will which is a long-term vision. We can't like policy sometimes works, have a short-term vision. We need, for this problem, for this pandemic, a long-term vision. So every action has to be thought for at least the next generation, I would say.
Thank you very much. May I turn to Ambassador Slapnitsar to see whether he has something on his wish list for the parliamentarians?
Thank you. I would probably, following the discussion, I'm not, let's say, on this coming from the social, from the civil society and the NGOs, but I would say three things came up to my mind. First one is, of course, to keep, I would not say raise the awareness, but to keep the awareness, talk about it, counter the narrative, what we have heard this morning on trying to weaken the narrative of the Istanbul Convention. Probably that's one. Second one, also my previous speaker mentioned this, how to say, use simple language. I mean, you know, in today's flood of information, I mean, it's difficult to distill what is the narrative of the message. So we should use simple language. You know, when you, for example, Istanbul Convention, it's known what it's about. But if you use all the time the long version, I mean, nobody would probably pay attention after that. So that's the second one. And the third one, I would say, usually the parliamentarians, they approve the budgets the government proposes. So it's up to the parliamentarians, first, of course, remind the governments that the sufficient funding is needed for the important work the civil society is doing. And as we have discovered during COVID pandemics, the demand, unfortunately, is higher for the services of the civil society in this area. So we should, you know, keep, how to say, if I may use this word, keep the demand to be to support this increased demand by sufficient funding. Thank you.
Excellent. Those were very clear wishes for the parliamentarians. We will make sure that they get recorded on our final documents. I now turn to Ms. Safrani to see whether she wants to present her wish list.
Thank you very much for this unique opportunity to have such a wish list. What I would like to show, to reflect, is that indeed parliamentarians would need to recognize the special, unique nature of violence against women based on the patriarchal societal order that we live in. And what goes hand in hand with this wish is the wish for them to cooperate with civil society actors and to recognize their unique knowledge. So women's rights organizations are the ones who are most directly informed by victims, women victims of male violence. They have a quick reaction to what has proved good in this area. But they are often in a difficult situation, as those who spoke before me have also said. They need more stability in financial terms as well, and in terms of the cooperation. And the finance, if I may request, should be sufficient, but fairer and easier as well to access from an administrative point of view. That would be also very helpful for our members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have the last panelist, Ms. Vition, has the chance to present her wish list.
So if I'm talking about the Istanbul Convention, implementation of Istanbul Convention, because for us it's a new process, it's not like it's just the beginning of a process, I would say We want, and I hope, what women organizations will be consulted during the planning of the implementation process and the priorities for the Republic of Moldova specifically now established, but I know that somehow this approach is common for post-Soviet countries in this part of the region. So my specific wish is to consult women organizations, women groups and women activists when establish the priorities for women in the Republic of Moldova. So to have these grassroots consultations and consult them in the process of the implementation and consult them when it's about financing, because this is also important. And to invest in women networks, in women organizations, because sometimes political parties and donors are working with visible organizations who have some expertise, advocacy, and who are talking and who are the central level. But this raises the discrepancy between organizations, and it doesn't contribute to a growing of women movement. So I would say to invest in women networks, to consider all organizations, and to build a women movement in the countries. So these are my wish list.
Thank you very much. I think all of those wishes are very reasonable and doable. So I think all the parliamentarians who are listening to us have taken due note of them. But as I said before, we will make sure they get recorded. So I think we have no requests from the floor. So perhaps just a couple of words from my side to conclude this session number 3. I would like to note down the positive changes that were signaled that the Istanbul Convention has indeed brought about in countries that have ratified the Istanbul Convention, but also it was noted that some countries that have not yet ratified are using it as an inspiration, not only in when they are drafting legislation, but also in adopting practices in this regard. So I think this is very important to note. Of course, you know that the Istanbul Convention is open for ratification by non-member states of the Council of Europe as well. And as we have often said, that although the Istanbul Convention was made in Europe, it's not meant for Europe only. So there is no copyright, and it of course should and can be used as an inspiration by also those who have not yet ratified it. I think it's also important to note, especially now in the time of COVID, which clearly is not yet over, and we see the amplification of this phenomenon, is that the cost of gender-based violence is actually so much bigger than any of the services that we have been talking here. So indeed, if those who are deciding on money were to look at the cost-benefit of actually investing also in civil society actions and into services and prevention, we would be actually saving a lot of money. And I think it's also important, because we are here in a framework of a parliamentary network, to underline the important role also the parliamentarians have, not only when they adopt the budgets, but also in the implementation and monitoring of the Istanbul Convention. It's one of those rare conventions of the Council of Europe, which gives a specific role for the parliamentarians. So I think this is very important to note, that they should actively play this role as well, not least when the evaluation report of Grevio on their specific country is published, but also all along the whole process of promotion and efficient implementation of the Istanbul Convention. And I think one important message, and this is the last one from me, is the united front. We really need to act together, and I think today actually has been a nice example, because everybody is very committed and ready to work together in the framework of this Istanbul Convention, not least our external partners, if I can call them like that, United Nations included, but of course the governments, parliamentarians, and the civil society. And the reference was made, of course, to the EU directive and how it's important that it is in line with the Istanbul Convention, and at least that it doesn't harm in a way the standards that we have achieved. And also this morning, I think the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women also brought on the table the discussions that are still coming up occasionally on UN possible standard on violence against women, and how this could indeed be also a challenge for the Istanbul Convention. So I think we have to really keep the united front and work together on this matter. So I thank all the panelists of the session number 3. And it's now my pleasure to give the floor to Edith Estrella, who on behalf of the network will do the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Sorry, are you hearing me? Good afternoon. I have the complex task of concluding discussions. I will do my best. Before presenting the conclusions, allow me to express my pride that my country, Portugal, was the first country to ratify the Istanbul Convention. And now I would like to remember you that recording will be on YouTube, so everyone interested can listen and consult when convenient. Good to have a record, as many MEPs are really busy with the end of the year activities. I would like to thank the speakers who presented interesting and converging ideas and recommendations. And special thanks to our General Rapporteur and colleague Zita Gurmai for having chaired and moderated the morning sessions. Thanks also to Maria Rotman, Director of Committees and the Head of Division 2 in the Assembly. We have 3 sessions with the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention at the center. First session, supporting the implementation of the Convention. Speakers were Grevio President Iris Luarazi, United Nations Women Regional Director Alia El Yassir for Europe and Central Asia, and Andrea Lourenço Marques. Mrs. Luarazi reported on the good progress and monitoring action with a total of 24 country reports prepared by Grevio since entry into force, with many states having changed their legislation to align with the definition in the IC in many areas, for example, on the legal definition of rape. She regretted the criticism and the misinterpretation and saw this opposition as a way of distracting attention from the violence against women still going on. Part of the uniqueness of the IC is that it is a legally binding instrument, and it also covers male victims of domestic abuse and child victims. Ms. Luarazi stressed that the convention does not imply that women and men are the same, but it does not attack family values, and that gender and sex are 2 separate concepts. She recalled that Article 72 of the IC involves MEPs in monitoring and encouraged more work on the baseline reports transmitted to parliaments. Alliances needed to be strengthened, political and financial support given, and more research on causes and consequences are needed. She referred to the Grevio's first general policy recommendation published a week ago on digital violence against women and girls and called for support. Ms. El Yassir began by underlining underlining the importance of joint efforts and commitments, and reminding the conference that for the United Nations, the IC is a gold standard which provides a clear operational recipe and brings together governments, parliaments, NGOs, regional organizations, and more. United Nations Women has a three-dimensional approach to its regional work based on normative action, coordination, and operational activities. The IC is part of the United Nations normative framework and one of the ways in which we can help push back the pushbacks. For Mrs. El Yassir, progress in closing the gaps towards equality is much too slow. Regional action was strong in the United Nations framework, for instance, through the Generation Equality Platform. 9 out of 19 countries in the region she is responsible for are part of the leadership or commitment-making structures. Private industry is also becoming more and more interested. She presented the examples of the United Nations Women's work in Albania, Serbia, and Turkey. Finally, she stressed that the personal is political, so violence against women and domestic violence is a highly political subject and needed to be recognized as such. She underlined that was a political issue. It was being instrumentalized in a negative way to promote political agendas. The president of the Gender Equality Commission, Andrea Lourenço Marques, explained that the Council of Europe's gender equality strategy was committed to achieving equality for all women, to ending violence, to eliminate sexism and gender stereotypes. The strategy was upheld by the action of the Committee of Ministers and used the presidencies of the Committee of Ministers to mainstream the issues of violence against women and raise visibility and awareness. For instance, the 2021 annual conference was co-organized with the German presidency of the Council of Ministers and marked the 10th anniversary of the IC. Our General Rapporteur had the good idea of asking speakers what they wished for to combine these wishes into a wish list for the months and years to come. Session 2 was devoted to political actions to counter attacks against the IC. Fiona Olulai, parliamentary, said that parliamentary situation in Ireland, many new legislative measures implemented on domestic violence, on criminal justice for sex offences, training for policy, etc. Before the ratification. Ratification was given good visibility, ambitious public consultation process, annual implementation plan and report, help to victims of violence and vulnerable whiteness. And quite substantial money was invested. Communicating about the purpose and value of the convention was crucial. Victims should not be further victimized. Arim Assalam pushback against the convention is a manifestation of pushbacks in society. Shouldn't be a surprise. Broad movement against women's rights, LGBTI rights, including non-state actors. Educate public, enhance public understanding, leave no stone unturned. Me Too movement, etc. should be better monitored, shared, studied. Language all can understand. We need to take back the narrative, and book for parliamentarians on the Istanbul Convention is an excellent example of tailored tools. If women's protection falls, everyone is in danger. Push back on IC, but also on ECHR in general. EC builds on CDAW and goes further. Engage state and non-state actors and human rights defenders. We will continue to be one of the voices adding to collective effort. Policymakers all needed educating. Naila Data warned the conference against the absence of direct denunciation of those who are against the gender equality. We have to name those who are beyond movements, she said. Opponents are not seeking clarity on gender. It is not backlash, it's a wider illiberal and anti-democratic political agenda. Anti-gender funding has risen greatly over the last 10 years. Some anti-gender NGOs, organisms have now left Brussels. They hide away from the limelight. Need to identify, monitor, and anti-gender forces. They are international. Media needs capacity building. Analysis of strategies of anti-gender movements. Anti-gender movements feel light of the day. Our general rapporteur had the good idea of asking speakers what they wished for, to combine these wishes into a wish list for the months and years to come. I have noted some of these wishes. All speakers wished for more member states to see that ratification makes positive change, more money. Senator O'Learning wished for more ratifications and to have some stay. There was a wish for more collaboration among those having ratified to learn more about how to act together. There was always need to funding and for changing cultures. More men need to be involved as role models. League of actors, more close alliances, and need to be more aware, organized, and anticipatory. Reference was made to be more coordinated. For instance, there was talk of the need for a new convention, but speakers felt this would weaken the current framework. CEDAW accounts for violence, and the IC has all we need as a framework. Another which was to be 2 steps ahead by contingency planning and risk assessment. In the afternoon, session 3 addressed promoting cooperation between politicians and the civil society to prevent and combat violence against women. Incoming Vice President of the IC Committee of Parties, Slovenian Ambassador Andrej Slapinaker, described the work to the ratification in February 2015 of the IC by Slovenia. He pointed out the joint declaration by Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia in the framework of Slovenia's presidency of the European Union. He stressed that it is very necessary to compare notes and synchronize with other members of international organizations. The work of NGOs should be encouraged and supported. Grevio meets with NGOs in preparing its reports and organizes action for NGOs. A lot remains to be done. There are many attempts to undermine the achievements. Civil society support services need to be supported, have sustainable funding, and allowed to work. Marcella Pirone reminded participants that NGOs were involved in the convention and had been there from the beginning as they were consulted on the content. After more than 30 years of experience on the ground, there is now an official network of NGOs. There is better, sometimes new legislation to protect women. In Hungary, for instance, NGOs were implementing the convention on a regional level. Real consultation needed to be maintained and developed. Attempts to manipulate and turn around civil society needed to be countered. More time should be spent in exchanges. European Women's Lobby Reka Safrani. The aim of EWA was to build a feminist Europe. Mrs. Safrani gave good examples of positive action. Members are asked to contact their MEPs. Turkey, EWL organized meetings with the EU officials to try to prevent withdrawal from the IC. 2 waves of campaigns were carried out based on the Council of Europe's recommendation against sexism. Board member of WAVE, Veronique Vition, began by stating her satisfaction at the finalization of the law on ratification of the IC by Moldova, despite strong opposition from the church. Politicians against the IC try to divide women amongst themselves. WAVE brings different groups of women together. Consultation in Moldova is often formal and technical. It should happen at all levels and at all stages. Women's organizations must be involved in decision-making processes, including funding. Important to share experiences. We have all we need amongst ourselves. To conclude, again, many thanks to all speakers and participants. This has been a great example of how we can build on our partnerships with and between governments, parliaments, NGOs, civil society, and international organizations. For 2022, I wish has all renewed strength to continue our work together and to finally succeed in reducing violence against women and girls across Europe. We need more inclusion, more equality, and as we heard today, more capacity to combat the anti-gender unequal forces that try to undermine the frameworks we have so carefully constructed. Thanks to interpreters and the Secretariat of the Commission, without whom this meeting would not have been possible. I wish we all a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you very much.